I'm trying to grow food in what is essentially beach sand. To combat that, I need more organic material, and I need more nutrients. On my very small, urban homestead, I don't have enough room for large compost piles, so I lean heavily on vermicast.
What's that?
Oh, what's that?
Well, it's manure. From worms.
Ew!
What good is that?
It's great, actually. It helps to normalize pH levels. The texture helps to reduce soil compaction. It helps soil retain moisture, facilitates airflow, and aids with drainage. If you make your own, it's also packed full of microorganisms and bugs that break down organic material, converting it into bioavailable nutrients that plants can absorb more readily. It's been shown to help seeds sprout more quickly and plants to grow stronger. It naturally repels and even kills some garden pests. Vermicast is also really good at providing macronutrients and micronutrients to the soil, but the exact level of nutrients depends entirely on what the worms are fed. I'll come back to that later in the video. I harvest over $1,000 worth of castings each year, with most of that being harvested in the spring. The more I create, the more I can harvest, and the more I can use to grow more food for my family. Worms can double their population in about 90 days when the conditions are right for them, and the spring is the best time of the year for them in Central Florida, where I live. If you live somewhere else,
I'm so sorry about that.
But hey, you can make the best of your situation with adjustments to account for your climate. Their ideal temperature range is around 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Hotter than that and they can dehydrate, or even worse, bake inside the bin. Cooler than that and they'll go into hibernation. But if they drop below freezing, they can literally turn into ice cubes, because just like humans, they're mostly made of water. Becoming an ice cube isn't good for humans. It isn't good for most plants, and it isn't good for worms either. If you live in a colder climate, you can try burying your bin in the ground, or wrapping it with something like hay or straw to insulate it from the cold. The colder your area, the more steps you'll need to take to keep them happy during the winter. Where I live, the bigger concern is actually keeping them from overheating, because we're in the 90s most of the year, and we can get over 100 during summer peaks. So I keep all of my bins in full shade to avoid turning their homes into plastic solar ovens. I also raise them up on blocks to allow for airflow all the way around, over, and under each bin. Side benefit of lifting them up on blocks is that I don't have to bend over as far when I'm working inside of the bins either. Please don't use a 5-gallon bucket as a worm bin. The big fat juicy worms that people tend to think of when they're thinking of earthworms travel fairly deep into the ground. But composting worms, such as red wrigglers and European nightcrawlers, stay closer to the surface. This means that the optimal bin size for them is about 12 to 18 inches deep. That also means they need more horizontal space to roam, so buckets have the wrong dimensions for them. I made that mistake when I first started, and a lot of worms died.
Wasn't pretty.
But that's part of life, right? Sometimes we make mistakes, and sometimes other people, plants, animals, or worms, pay the price for our mistakes. When, not if, that happens, we can't go back in time and undo our mistakes. We can learn from it though. We can observe the consequences of our choices and we can grow from those mistakes. In this case, I repurposed the 5-gallon buckets for other uses and moved the surviving worms into my first bin. I find that these black bins with the yellow lids are the perfect size. They hold a lot and they're still very portable. If you get good quality bins, they're extremely durable too. I've never had to replace any of mine. I just add to them. I got this one at Costco for less than $10, but they're available at places like Lowe's and Home Depot as well. I've seen videos demanding that specific hole sizes are needed in various locations of the bins. Here's the thing though, the hole sizes, quantities, and locations depend on your circumstances. Depends on how hot or cold the weather is, how humid it is, what you're trying to put into the bin, and what you're trying to keep out of the bin as well. In my case, I'm in Central Florida, and while we do occasionally get brief periods dropping into freezing temperatures, we're extremely hot most of the year, so I need ventilation to release hot air. We're also very humid most of the year, which reduces evaporation, so I need good drainage. I use a lot of kitchen scraps that tend to be wet, and that increases the need for drainage. However, I try to keep soldier flies and other large flies out of the bin, so I need small holes on the sides. As a result of all of that, I'm using a fairly small drill bit on the sides for airflow, and a medium-sized drill bit on the bottom for drainage. For me, this is good because it allows water and air to flow without letting castings fall out the bottom or larger bugs to get into the bin from the sides. I'm not worried about the worms escaping for two reasons. They typically try to avoid the sunlight that's outside the bin during the daytime, And as I said earlier, they multiply fast enough that I'm not worried about some of them choosing to leave the paradise that I'm making for them to take their chances in the wild, wild world.
I'm gonna go to Wild, Wild West World.
If you put your bin directly on the ground, you may want to keep a closer eye on how many worms crawl out of the bottom. They do move around a lot and will readily explore about 10 to 12 inches down. If your bin is on the ground and you have less than a foot of material in the bin, they may explore downwards below the bin. They'll most likely stay near the bin though, and as your material builds up, they'll probably find their way back in again. Also, if you put your bin on the ground, you may need to keep a closer eye out for roots finding their way into the bin through those holes. I'm ensuring that the holes in the bottom are spaced out and located in areas that will be the lowest points on the bin so that water can't pool inside. On the sides, I'm only putting holes near the top because hot air rises, and I want to use thermodynamics to release the hottest air from the bin. I'm not putting them in a straight line though because, a row of holes just creates a perforation mark and that substantially weakens the bin. Now that I have a new bin, I'm going to layer in a little bit of our native soil.
What's with all this sand?
Well, Florida is basically one big beach, so our native soil is almost entirely sand. But in this case, I'm adding it because worms don't have teeth. Similar to chickens, they need grit in order to digest their food. Next, I'm going to harvest some of the castings from each of my other bins to help kickstart the microbiology in this new bin. Without this layer, everything will still work, but it'll take longer for the first few batches of vermicast. The microbiological diversity will keep getting better over time. Also, notice that I'm not separating worms from castings. With my first worm bin, I spent hours upon hours upon hours separating out the worms from the castings with each harvest so that I could put the worms back into the bin before using the castings. Over time though, I realized that's not necessary, for me at least. Each bin holds tens of thousands of worms and they repopulate fast enough throughout most of the year that I now simply harvest worms along with the castings and spread all of it under plants, or in this case, into the new bin. The inclusion of worms and worm eggs each time I provide some of the castings to my garden soil means that I'm not just providing nutrients. I'm also providing live microbiology and live worms to convert the organic material in each garden bed into a continuous stream of more bioavailable nutrients to the soil. That helps the whole garden. So I'm stocking my new bin with worms from my existing bins. If you want to start a new bin and don't have any worms, there are a few companies online that sell worms specifically intended for worm compost bins. This is important because just like people, different types of worms prefer different types of living conditions and have different levels of work habits. Several years ago, I bought my original worms from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. If you're looking for a good source, I put a link to their website in the description below. I'm not affiliated with them or sponsored by them in any way though, and this isn't an endorsement, so I'm sorry I don't have any discount codes for you. I bought a package with 1,000 red worms, and since then the generations have multiplied into several tens of thousands of worms, helping me to grow food more sustainably. Speaking of food, that's the next layer. Composting worms tend to live in the soil and eat from underneath the scraps, so there's no need to disrupt their home by mixing scraps into the dirt layer. Just dump the food on top. I use a combination of different ingredients depending on what we have at the time. Remember, diversity is good while keeping things in moderation. Some orange peels are fine. A lot of orange peels are not so fine. How about carrot and potato peels? It's in there. Apple cores? It's in there. Moldy cheese? It's in there. Eggshells? It's not in there. You can, but I don't. I'll tell you why in a minute. But wilted lettuce? It's in there. Coffee grounds? Absolutely. I toss in the filter too. Chunks of fat caught off of meat? It's in there. Leftovers that sat in the fridge for far too long? It's in there.
That's gross.
Char from the fire pit? It's also in there. So are trimmings from plants around the yard.
The possibilities are endless here.
Different people have different opinions on what can or can't be put in a worm bin. I've been doing this for several years now though, and personally I'm comfortable putting just about anything in my bins as long as it's organic. This means that anything that used to be alive is probably fair game. Just watch out for poisonous plants or plants with poison sprayed onto them, and be aware that animal-based items may attract attention from cats, dogs, raccoons, or other animals looking for a snack. I also recommend avoiding anything with seeds unless you're okay with those seeds sprouting and growing plants. Most of the best tomato plants, pepper plants, and even watermelon that I've got on my homestead, they're actually what I call vermicast plants. They popped out from the seeds that came from the vermicast. As I was feeding the worms, the seeds mixed in and then later sprouted after I used the vermicast to fertilize plants. Even though I typically feed my worms once a week, they can easily go a couple of weeks between feedings. This is especially true for a new worm bin. Just like all other life forms, the more there are, the more food they're going to need.
Doesn't matter what side you're on, everybody's got to eat.
So as the population grows, I'll feed them more. The weather impacts their eating pattern too. When it gets cold, the worms slow down. They move less, they multiply less, and they eat less. Be careful not to overfeed your worms. If you do, they won't be able to eat fast enough, and they'll leave food for other things that you may not want in your bin.
Well, there are bugs.
There are insects out there that will take advantage of you.
If you find a lot of food still in the bin at the end of the week, cut back on your feeding for the next level so that they can catch up a little bit. My wife and I go through a lot of eggs each week, but I don't put the shells in my worm bin anymore. Proponents of putting eggshells into worm bins cite the calcium levels and the need for worms to have grit, claiming that the shells break down into pieces that the worms can use as grit.
I feel a butt coming on.
Studies show that eggshells actually take a very long time to break down into something that can be absorbed by plants or worms. So, in order to help that go faster, you can stick them in an oven and bake them until they're brittle. Or I just toss them in a fire pit. As the fire burns, the eggshells change color, lose their shape, and may even crumble completely into the ash. When the fire is put out though, the calcium is still there. It's mixed in with the ash and the other nutrients that don't burn at normal fire pit temperatures. This makes it a great natural fertilizer for landscaping and garden beds. Just be careful spreading it around acid-loving plants though. The ash and the calcium add alkalinity to the soil, which can slow down or even kill plants that need a more acidic soil. I lightly cover the food scraps with shredded cardboard, paper, or leaves. This helps to reduce flies and gnats. It provides bulk. It provides carbon to balance the high nitrogen content of kitchen scraps. It provides bedding material for the worms, and it helps with moisture control. If the bin is too wet, I provide more bedding to absorb the moisture. I also typically spray some water on top of each bin because worms breathe through their skin, and they can't do that if they're dried out. So I carefully add bedding and water in different quantities for each bin with each feeding, always striving to keep the moisture levels in balance. With my thumb on the wetter side of the scale, because worms can't breathe if they're not moist.
Moist.
But if the bin becomes saturated, the water will push the air out of the vermicast, and while worms need moisture, they also need air. It shouldn't be dry. It shouldn't be soggy or waterlogged either.
It's moist.
Alright, so let's put the lid back on and let these guys be fruitful and multiply.
Where is the treasure?
Oh, I'm sorry, you wanted to see the treasure now. Oh, okay. It looks like they're happy in their new home, and they are already hard at work making more vermicast for me to use around my tiny little homestead, which means I need to end this video and get to work spreading some of it so they have the room to keep growing and making more. If you'd like to see more of my tiny little homestead and how I'm growing on it, subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to keep on growing, and you should too. Oh, and watch this video next.